As we've been discussing all term, one of the features of technical communication is the use of visuals. For your recommendation report, you will be designing an illustration. You might design more than one, but one is what you're expected to include on your recommendation report. As a lot of you realized from your document analysis, visuals are an effective way to present information to a reader in an easily accessible and a solid way that does a lot more than just presenting the information in the text itself. This video will cover some of the different types of illustrations and allow you to think about what kinds of illustrations will be most effective for you to present the information that you need to present in your recommendation report. A brief note, I'm using a slide set designed by Megan Gerke, who is one of my graduate students. I made some updates to this slideshow, but overall the content is compiled from her. It calls on both information that she's used and also the chapter from The Essentials of Technical Communication that I'm having you read alongside this presentation. So a brief overview about some of the things you want to think about when creating illustrations. The first is that overall they need to be fairly simple in the sense that they're not presenting too much information at once, and they also need to be usable, meaning that a user can easily grasp the information you need them to grasp. This goes into selecting the type, making sure that you include different features to make sure that they're clear and usable, and also effective design through the use of colors and scale and different options. So the first thing in thinking about that is that you're going to be probably using some sort of computer application to design your illustration. Whenever you use a computer application and you're using such a tool such as Microsoft Word's graphics editor, for instance, you want to use those tools critically. They have lots and lots of design options, but it doesn't mean that those design options are equally valid or effective. So for instance, for the most part, you should avoid anything that's too fancy or overly designed in terms of the graphic. So for instance, some of them have 3D applications that you can add on to show a pie chart, but it looks 3D or has different slices. They don't look good and they are not effective and they can actually misrepresent your information. So keep it simple and keep it clear and be very critical with the use of your applications. Each illustration should have a title or a caption, a number, and labels as appropriate. The caption allows you to describe both concisely but fully what the figure is representing. The number, of course, is if you have more than one figure, is to distinguish them from each other. Even if you only have one figure, you should still number them. If you have figures and tables, keep in mind that it's typical that those numbering systems are actually different. So for instance, you can have figure 1 and table 1. You'll want to keep them separate like in that way. Finally, if your figure has different areas that need labeled, you should apply labels to make sure that the components represented on the illustration are clear. The next thing you'll want to do is in the text, alert your readers to the graphic. So in some way you need to refer to directly in the text that what the information is on the graphic. Don't just say see figure 1. Make sure you actually explain a little bit about what the graphic is representing. The idea here is that the visual is paired up with information in the text and that you want both of those to make sure that your reader can understand the context for the visual and then go and look at the visual or vice versa. If you don't include one, it's quite possible that your reader would get confused and not understand what you're showing them. In the same vein, you want to position the figure strategically within the text. So wherever your reference is to this figure, the first time you refer to it, you want to make sure the figure is near that reference. Typically it goes after. Obviously you want to take into account that if you put a figure somewhere and there's a whole bunch of white space, that possibly you want to move it and change where it is. And make sure that it's appropriately sized, that your reader can see and understand what is on the text. And then finally, if you're pulling data from another source, or you want to make sure the reader understands where your information comes from, you want to credit your sources. You can do this in the text as well as in the label. So be sure that you're crediting your sources, even if your source is the survey that you yourself have conducted. So the next phase is talking about different types of illustrations, and not all visuals are created equal, so you want to keep in mind that you want to carefully select the type of visual based on the information and the relationships you want to show. Your first type is tables, which a lot of you used in your proposal, and it can be a very easy way just to represent information in a concise and clear way. So here is a table that breaks down components from writing, reading and research, and course community. This was designed by Megan. It summarizes information quickly. They have helpful headings. Make sure you always include headings on a table. And again, put a caption on it, table 1, which shows whatever here. Separate it from, it can separate your data from the surroundings. So if you have information that you want to call out for some reason, placing it in a table can be an effective way to make sure it's separate from the text and it stands out from the paragraph. So your reader eye is drawn to it. It's simple. And the last thing is in the design, you don't have to always use lines to separate individual components. So here you see, for instance, that each one has 2 or 3 different paragraphs. She's using white space instead of lines, partly because the different items are of different length, and partly because she, as a designer, does not like a whole lot of lines. So be very discerning and think critically again about the use of the lines. The next type is the bar and column graph, and they're often used to compare and contrast different data points, and they can also reveal change over time. So for instance, the top chart shows this hourly compensation cost in manufacturing, and you can see very quickly who's the top and who's the bottom. It shows that relationship for the year of 2011. The bottom one shows change over the time from 2008 to 2013 in terms of global exports. And then you see a relationship between the US, the European Union, and China and others. And so there it allows you to see very quickly what that the EU, for instance, has experienced some increase in exports, whereas the other countries are fairly stable. And you can visually see that without really having to dig too much into the different points. On these types of charts, it is really important to label the axes and make sure that the units of measure are clear. So on the top chart, the 0 through 60 is US dollars, whereas the bottom on the y-axis, you see that it's 0 to 6, but it's in millions of tons. So that those units of measure need to be very clear. On that chart, even the year, it's clear that it's probably the year, but that could be potentially labeled more accurately as well. You can also use color to group information. Color is a lot more effective, especially if you're able to print in color or it's being displayed on a screen. It's more effective to use color than different variations of shading, which could potentially get confused depending. So color is an effective tool that you should use. The next things you want to think about are being accurate with your measures. If you are trying to show a relationship that's not really there, you can often skew the data points to make it look like something is bigger or greater than it actually is, and you want to avoid that. That's unethical. And accuracy here is really important because the visual impact does overwhelm the data points often. Limit your divisions to 4 or 5. For instance, the graph at the top is it has a lot of data points, but it's one number. It's the cost of manufacturing over time. You could add a lot more data to this, but it would be very confusing. On the bottom, you have just 5 different year sets and then 4 different countries. Again, there's a lot of information here, but it's pretty simply represented, so it's divided to 4 to 5. And then finally, keep in mind that labels are better than legends. The bottom uses a legend to represent the countries, but since there's only 4 different countries in question, it's fine to use a legend there, but at the top, the label with each country, instead of using a color and then legend, it makes it clearer what's happening there. Circle graphs are one that most of you may consider using, especially if you're giving a survey that has like 3 options, because then you can represent what percentage of your participants answered what question in what way. So circle graphs are divisions of a subject. So generally, if you're representing 100%, you're breaking it down into individual percentages. It doesn't really work if you don't have that 100% and pieces of the 100%. Restricted to 7 or 8 items. If you have too many divisions on your pie chart, it can get really confusing as to what percentages represent what, and it gets really muddy in terms of looking at them. Typically, you have horizontal labels across the bottom, although you might actually put the labels next to the data point they represent. So for instance, the 2 vehicles could be right next to the 37%. What you see here though is that they have included the percentage on top of the different slices of the circle, because if you don't have that there, it's unclear what the percentages are. And so for instance, you wouldn't be able to see that there are slightly more people who own 2 vehicles versus 1 vehicle. So that's a helpful way of labeling. Typically in designing, you put the biggest section at the top right corner and then you work clockwise. And then you can use color to help further distinguish the different sections of the pie. So this is another way to use color effectively. Line graphs are another illustration. You can represent change over time. And so there's a degree and direction of change relative to 2 different variables. So here is percentages over years, so from 2000 to 2011. Again, you want to make sure you label both axes, and the lines themselves are also labeled, and so you see that here. We also have a division between gender, so there's essentially 2 different line graphs, but they're next to each other so you can actually see the comparison really effectively, which is a nice way to further show relationships. The appropriate scale is another way that you want to think of using ethical approaches here. If you don't represent the scale accurately or the slope accurately, it can be seen as a misrepresentation or unethical in terms of how you present your data. And try to avoid going for more than 3 data lines on one graph. This one works because they're clearly distinguishable, but if you have 3 different items that are sort of intermingling, it can be really confusing to separate the 3 or more than 3. Just really quickly, this is an organizational chart which just shows hierarchy. So you have lines that show relationships among the various members of an organization, and then a sense of hierarchy. There's consistency, there's labeling, and there's the connecting the dots, so with lines and dotted lines. Flowcharts are another way of showing a process. So whereas an organizational chart shows the relationship of one individual to a whole within an organization and a hierarchy, a flowchart can represent a process instead. So this is a very simple flowchart that shows essentially your 3 options if you are hungry. One is to starve, one is to buy food, and one is to cook at home. And you could follow the lines to go hungry, buy food in restaurant, eat food. This shows a sense of process of how to make a decision, or what are the different factors that go into a different process. You might see these often in an engineering workplace because you are creating complex processes. So if like one thing happens, it will trigger something else to happen, versus if back at that step something else happened, it might go a different direction. So this can be beneficial to help represent a process to your viewer. So match the design to complexity, be consistent with the shapes, making sure that the shapes at the various levels of hierarchy are the same or different to distinguish them, and of course include labels on each element of the flowchart. Your diagram is another pictorial representation of a process, and here a diagram tends to be a simplistic design of a component or a part, or some sort of technology, for instance, and you want to identify the key components of the item that you are presenting a diagram of, and the spatial relationships as well. So here you actually see essentially a schematic for a full process, but it labels the pieces, and so you get both a sense of process, but also what are the key functions or key pieces of the whole. So it's not to scale, and there's a lot of different ways that this is not accurate in terms of reality, but it highlights the things that are important for the viewer, and it's very simple and clean, and so it strips away anything that's not really necessary to understand at this point in time, and everything is clearly labeled to make sure that the viewer can understand what's going on. And your last, or the second to last visual, is your photographs. They're expected to be realistic, so you can't crop them in a way that makes it confusing to understand what you're looking at. So be consistent with your editing and your cropping. And then finally, think about labeling. So without the labels, this photograph would be really complex. There's a lot going on here. So if you have a photograph and you want to make sure the reader is paying attention to something, make sure to label it really clearly, as they've done here with arrows and a clear caption that stands out. And then finally, you have your infographic, which tends to be simple images matched up with text. Of course, the images need to be appropriate for your audience. So something like this that's very cartoonish might not be appropriate for a technical setting. However, if you're trying to convey information to, say, young adults, something like this might be eye-catching and appropriate for that audience. You also want to make sure that the images you include don't undermine the gravity of the situation. So, for instance, if you're talking about something really serious, such as safety with using a particular kind of equipment, but you have all these fun cartoonish images, that's undermining the gravity of the situation, and it may not be appropriate for use. You reinforce the images with captions, explanatory text, and labels so that there's different ways of representing the information to make sure that it's really clearly communicated to the user. So the last part of this video is talking about ethical editing. You've heard me refer to different ways you can be unethical with how you present information. So what do we mean by ethical editing and essentially ethical design? Ethics in illustrations, it's really easy to misrepresent information. If you skew the different axes and you mess with the values. So the top graph here shows what looks to be like an extreme increase, like, you know, it's more than quadrupled over time. But then if you actually take a look at it, the change is from 35% to 39.6%. So 4.4% is the change that they're looking at. So if you look at this graph, you realize that the visual impact of it makes it look much more extreme than it actually is. And what they've done is there on that axis is the values are from 34 to 42%. So they're using a very small span of values in order to blow up the distinction. And so if you're trying to show a change, I mean, it's fine to show an increase. That's not what is a problem. But the problem here is that they're visually misrepresenting the information. And this would be considered unethical because the viewer is going to be more impacted by the appearance of a massive change than they are going to see the values and go, oh, it's only 4.4%. Still an increase, but it's not as excessive as the graph makes it out to be. So if you actually edited the graph and look there and below, you'll see that this is a much more ethical representation of that information because you see the change is fairly small and is more proportional to what is actually happening. So make sure that when you have information, you show what's there, nothing more. Don't try to make a trend when there is no trend. Don't try to make a change look more excessive than it really is because, you know, if something's a 0.2 change, maybe that's not statistically significant, so you want to be careful with that. If you're using videos and photos, you want to also be careful with thinking about how you're editing those to make sure that you're representing people correctly and you're representing photos in a way that matches reality if somebody was there. And the key takeaway here is to be sensitive with your design choices. You want to make sure that you are attending to the needs of the audience, you're not misrepresenting your data, and you're not doing anything that would be considered unethical or be confusing for the reader. So sometimes even confusion can be considered a problem that you want to avoid, even if you're not setting out to purposefully misrepresent information. So that's all. We've covered those three main points about the illustrations. So as you go forward and think about your recommendation report, consider what kind of illustration would be most effective and consult your textbook for more information about what you want to think about when you create and design illustrations.